Okay, good afternoon, colleagues in the room, and good afternoon, colleagues online. I trust you can hear me.
Yes,
I think that's it.
Yeah, well,
So thanks so much for joining us for this very interesting noon meeting presentation entitled How to Steal a Public Entity. But what I'm really hoping that we're going to learn about today is ways to safeguard the governance of key public institutions as we seek to strengthen our public institutions and as we seek to move closer to universal health coverage. So our presenter today is Professor Tim Tucker, who is an adjunct associate professor in the School of Public Health and has been for probably the past 8 years now. And Tim is a long-standing member of the University of Cape Town community, having done his MBCHB here, if I'm not mistaken, together with a number of other degrees, including a PhD, and then being a member of staff and so on and so forth. But more recently, he's been the CEO of Seed Consulting or Consultancy, and a board member of various key boards, including the MRC, Mothers to Mothers, and Shawco, et cetera, So in short, a person that really has a good sense of South Africa and of what it takes to run the health system and to strengthen the health system in South Africa. So we're excited to hear what he says, and already planning to get him involved in some of my diploma and MPH teaching in the not too distant future. So thanks very much, Tim. Over to you, about 35 minutes, and then engagement with the floor. Over to you.
Thank you, Sue, for that introduction. And it's always such a pleasure to be here and a privilege to be part of your school, this university, having trained here and been a member of staff and then an adjunct for the last 25 years or so. It is a privilege also to talk to this topic, which clearly is a topic that engages us about how to prevent people stealing public entities in this age where we've had to deal so much with state capture. And so, let's see how I'm going to. Yeah, many of those are hidden slides, just in case you're getting nervous. So, it's a pleasure to be here, and I am CEO of Seed Consulting, which is a public health organization that runs programs across the country and across part of the region. And I have been a member of staff at the university in clinical virology and now the School of Public Health for some time. I am also a member of the South African Medical Research Council board and previously the NHLS, and a combined time of more than a decade of time in public entities on their boards. And so I come today being a member of multiple private and public and non-profit boards to give you some reflections on possibilities for how people systematically go about attacking and raiding our public entities, which are the jewels of our national structures. And so why this topic? Well, most of us are public servants, and those who are not true public servants are often servants of the public, and we have an obligation to witness our current challenges and respond to them. I also look at the group here in the university structures as leaders and developing leaders who are often not trained in governance, although we are often asked to be part of governance structures. And I think it's something that the university needs to think about, in that so many of us are asked to be part of various boards and are not trained in that. So, there are very number of governance roles, as we'll talk about, and we need to understand the risk patterns and to be able to pick them up so as to prevent state capture. And it's very easy to look at the big state capture, the Gupta-like environment, and think that that's what it's all about. But one has to see that the capture of state institutions goes down to very small environments too. How many of us have been part of school governing bodies, and they have been a focus across the country of raiding for personal financial gain? We also need to think about our own colleagues in fellow universities, where the gangs have entered, the criminal syndicates have entered, and they're quite comfortable to raid the millions and kill and maim people in order to do this. And so, as we look at the breadth of this, we need to understand that it is significant amounts of money. Perhaps the Guptas alone and their state capture raided in excess of 4% of GDP per year, which we had taken off our 4% of growth per year, and that has had major impacts immediately and down the line. But also, it's important not to get too depressed just about public institutions. This state capture and the capture for personal gain is a public and a private matter. And you think of the more than $200 billion dollars of value that went out the window with the Steinhoff alone. These are not just public entity rating systems. It goes across the board. We have many public entities, and we sometimes get confused by all the nomenclature because there's Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 and Schedule 3A and 3B, and there's more than, I think, 250 public entities over here. There is the Afrikaanse Taal Museum in Paarl, that bastion of progressive thinking of the 1970s and 80s that still gets funding from the state. There's Artscape. There's all sorts of things that we as citizens may want to or may need to get involved with. And I have been involved in Schedule 3A entities for more than a combined decade with the NHLS and the Medical Research Council, and we'll be giving you some insights there. But specifically within the health state-owned enterprises, I list some over there that many of us have been involved with. And in addition to that, there are other health entities that you might get involved with. So many of us are involved in things like College of Medicine, HPCSA, etc., as well as the public and private hospitals. To understand how state capture happens, you have to understand the systemic nature of it and to understand how legal entities of all sorts function. And all entities have within it a governance component, they have an executive component, and they have a general staffing component. And every entity also has a shareholder. And in public entities, it's government that is the shareholder. And we need to remember that shareholders are quite aggressive in the private sector and get involved and demand things of the organizations that they own. And it's a reasonable expectation that we should have that our shareholder of public entities, government, will also get involved. But it's about how and what the boundaries are thereof. It's important to see that when we are on a school governing body, you are on the board. And the headmaster or headmistress is the CEO of the school, and then there's senior staff, and then there are other staff. Every single entity that we get involved with has the same structure. And when those who seek to destroy and raid come to your entity, they will be looking at specific elements, as we will talk about today. And so today, what I'm hoping to do is to take you briefly, and it's briefly because this is a massive topic, through some of the political risk areas, some of the legal risk areas. I won't speak specifically to a specific topic of personal, but you will see how there's a personal aspect to it as well. At-risk individuals who placed for nefarious purposes that will feed through my presentation. I will talk about board level issues, executives and staff, and then the importance of what we call oversight. So let's start with the political risks. So, political appointments are a global phenomenon. And when we see our politicians appoint their favorite people, we have hysteria and outrage. And sometimes that hysteria and outrage is appropriate. But we need to remember that across the globe, political appointments are a norm. And it's the issue is how far down in the system are political appointments appropriate. But we've needed this. And if you think about the transition to democracy in 1994, there was a whole cadre of senior and medium level people who had supported the apartheid state that was still there. And it was important to change those staff members in order to achieve change, because many of those were still deeply entrenched in old thinking and were not open to the new thinking. And so the political appointments at more levels than would have normally been appropriate was appropriate at that stage to achieve the change that was required. But these things change over time, and the issue of balance is very important as we look at political appointments. We need to look, when it comes to political engagement, as to whether there's interference, because there has to be a boundary between party and government. There has to be boundaries between the political appointees and the administrative arm of government. Remember, political appointments come and go with election cycles, whereas administrative arm of government is loyal to the government of the day. And it's important that the state-owned enterprises are seen within that context. It's really important to look at issues of independence, as we'll talk about, and the rationality test. Something that is rational in one setting may not be rational in another. And so you need to apply principles and explain why you have done that. We need to look at political engagement and interference with regard to funds, because politicians may not make their appointments, but they may starve your funds, or they may flood you with funds. And so when you look at the money flows, you will often see what kinds of political engagement there are. We also need to look at loyalty to a cause. So is the individual who's seconded to a board or an executive position more loyal to their party or to the organization they are a part of? I will talk to the NHLS, where there were provincial members on the board, and they often had greater loyalty to their province than they did to the board that they were serving on. And so this is a consideration. And so you get the issues of cadre deployment, the various opinion pieces around the importance of addressing this issue. Let's move to the legal risks and the need to engage. I cannot stress the importance when one is on a board of the need to engage. This formal process of changing the legal landscape is critically important, particularly as we move to democracy, particularly in a developmental state where old laws need to be changed. But it's important that these are driven by policy guidelines. I'd sometimes sit in a committee or a board and go, I understand what you want to do, but what is the policy that is driving this? Every single legal change can't just come about because somebody's woken up with a good idea. It has to be based in policy that drives us. And when you sit on a board and you see proposed changes, you need to look for risk, political risk. Are the changes going to inhibit or enable corruption? Will those changes change your ability to operate? And that's a critical thing. It may have good political sense, but it may actually hamstring the organization. And lastly, how much consultation and engagement has there been? Any kind of legal change is inevitably complex and needs engagement. So what I'll do for the legal risk considerations, I'll take an example of the NHLS Amendment Act. So the NHLS came into being in 2000, and it has a legal mandate which is threefold. It has to provide a pathology service, it has to provide teaching to technologists, technicians, and pathologists, and it has a research agenda. And as I give these examples, you need to see how these are very important, because it's this university, amongst others, that is involved in all of that. So firstly, I want to have the issue of engagement. Now, this is the report from Parliament around the NHLS Amendment Act going through, and the one comment I pick up there was that there was no debate. Now, that's okay about one act, because maybe it was debated in the parliamentary committees and all of in a stage where it was still a bill, but the proportion of political changes that happen in the absence of public debate is worrying. And I would argue that this is an issue. It's also notable that when the NHLS Amendment Act came into bill was being debated, there was not a single university that put in any notes of concern or support. It was hard to get any kind of debate going, despite the fact, as you will see, that there were significant changes. So it's not that this didn't have debate, it's that there's so many pieces of legislation that go through without adequate debate. So here's an issue that relates to, is there interference versus normal relationships with the public entities? So the appointment of a chief executive officer is something that is in every single act of work that governs a state-owned enterprise. And the appointment of a chief executive officer used to say that the board will appoint, but in the Amendment Act, the board will appoint in consultation with the minister, or in some acts it says with the approval of the minister, which, if you want to have complete control of your staff, then don't create a separate legal entity. You should empower that legal entity, you should trust the board, and then enable them to do their job. Now, of course, you have to have some kind of discussion, but it's about the trend to not being able to make senior appointments without the relevant minister being consulted. And you know, this is something to consider. I'm not proposing that consultation with the minister is inappropriate, but it's the trend across the board. to have the minister deciding in all the different entities who should be in the leadership position. So if you take, for example, the MRC Act, it says there that the board shall appoint a chief executive officer. That's fine. It also has a worrying this is the current act, right, which has been in place for a long time, in that the CEO, the president, needs to be a medical practitioner. We've all agreed for a long time that's not appropriate. We need to expand that. But when the act is renegotiated and that is appropriately expanded, almost certainly they'll put the constrictive clauses in as well. And so that's where you need to have balance. My point here is not right or wrong. It's about balance that we need to achieve. Here we are with regard to the teaching service research element. There was no comment from a single university, despite the fact that the definition of teaching environment changed. They changed the issues of how they would describe operational research, and that's a key issue. It changed from doing efficient health laboratory to only doing diagnostic health laboratory research. They tried to put in that they would only support training of registrars as opposed to provide and support. And those kinds of key wordings may sound legally boring, but if you don't provide and support, then it becomes an unfunded mandate. And therefore, you have problems in that kind of space. And so my point here with regard to legal risk is that boards need to consider legal changes and make sure that they are what we require. Let's move away from that into the structures of an organization. And in the structures of an organization, the most senior part of an organization is its board, and the CEO then reports to the board. I will come back to the internal audit at a later stage. And then the CEO has a series of senior executives in different programs, HR, finance, etc. And then each of those executives have staff. And you will see this diagram come up over and over in the coming slides. So the board is the highest level custodian. It is a governance function, not an executive function. And it's really, really important that they are independent. Let me give you an example. The NHLS was contentious in its establishment because some of the provinces didn't want a national pathology provider. They each had their own provincial segments. And so to appease the provinces, each province got a representative on the board. But now the provinces are the majority group on the board. And when there's a contestation about the NHLS billing the province, now suddenly you have board members who have split loyalties between trying to balance the budgets in their provinces and being independent in the board and so on. So there are those kinds of things that one needs to think about. A strong chairperson is important. One has to have a spread of knowledge across the different areas, and you have to have people who know the business, whether it's Eskom or Transnet or MRC. You need to have people who know the business. Again, I won't go into detail again, but the importance of a good relationship with the so-called line department. For us, it's almost always the Department of Health or the Department of Science and Innovation. One has to look very carefully as a board when it comes to state capture about the issuing of instructions. The minister has a vested interest in what goes on there, but if the minister or the director general issues instructions about what you should do, you need to think carefully about it because they're entitled to a request, but instructions have a different level of authority that one needs to think about. As a board, one needs to be principled and brave. And it's often said that being a board member is a risky thing. And until I was on these boards, I used to poo-poo the idea. It was, well, I know there's risk, but we'll talk a little bit about risk in a moment. And you have to be brave because you have to do things legally. You have to do things to the benefit of the organization in the area of even when it's contested. Boards need to have continuity. They need to have firm declarations of interest. Almost every single set of corruption in our state capture environment has involved conflicts of interest that were not declared. And boards need to have training. I've talked about the stakeholder board membership now. And what we also need to do so I've talked about the risk as well. Let's move on to executives. Once again, the same diagram, and the executives are the CEO and his or her executives one layer down. Now, it's important that executives execute the mandate and that they are protected from board and governance and government interference. I've sat in places where a board member said, yes, I understand you're going to be putting that tender out. Can I give input on it? And when you get those kinds of patterns, you need to think very carefully about it, as well as when you get instructions and interference from the line department. The board needs to have exceedingly high levels of trust with the CEO and the executives, because you get delegation of responsibility. Even though you as a board may be ultimately responsible, you give all the authority to the executives to run the organization. And as such, you need to watch out for CEO or executive overreach or over control of their staff, because what are their intentions when it comes to their own delegations of responsibility? When looking at, from a board level at the organization, you need to look at the needs for transparency versus confidentiality. There are some things which are confidential, but there are other things which are made confidential when transparency, such as tenders. I am a firm believer that all tenders should be done in a transparent environment. We need to look at that kind of balance to ensure that the big ticket items are not corrupted. We also need to look, when we're looking at executive functions, that some departments have greater reach than others. So, and the classic one is an IT department, where the decisions made in IT affect almost every other department at all and have knock-on effects. And so you may have no ability to operate in your HR department because of decisions that are made in your IT department. And if that department is corrupted, then everything else has to then follow on, because somebody's got a tender which does not adequately serve the interests of the organization. There are very specific fiduciary responsibility areas that carry risk, and the CEO is the accounting officer, and then finance is another area which clearly is a risk area. Now, corruption can happen in the absence of those two being corrupted, quite clearly. But they are high-risk areas, and boards need to look at that. Importantly, and I want to stress that although the CEO and the CFO do carry disproportionate responsibility and risk, corruption happens across the board at all levels. Let's get down to the next level of staff. Once again, corruption can happen anywhere, but procurement and supply chain management are central components. And we need to look at how we protect those individuals from inappropriate contact from outside, from potential bidders. And we also need to ensure that not only are they protected, but that we ensure that all of their decisions have integrity as well. But I put a red line around all of them, because every staff member is open to corruption and to corrupting processes. Procurement is a central part, as I pointed out in the last slide. I'm a firm believer, as I've said, about open processes. One doesn't have to let out the intellectual property that is contained in a tender bid, but the fact that the process is performed in a certain way and tenders are opened up so that everyone knows who's bidding and what their pricing is, etc. I think all of that should, in almost all circumstances, be in the public domain. One needs to look at why executives are proposing a single source. Why is it that there's only one provider in the world that can provide this piece of expensive technology? Now, we've seen this in this environment here, certainly, when it comes to laboratory work. If you've got a multi-site study across the world and they need to have the same test performed, then you do need the same single source procurement, but there needs to be a reason, motivation, etc. But one needs to look at that. One needs to look at the specificity of specifications. That's a redundancy. You need to look at the specificity of tender specifications, because if they're overly specific, you need to work out, well, is it that group that is already pre-appointed by way of the tender specifications? You need to look at timelines. If you put a tender out, it's got to be in 3 days' time. What is that about? We need to look at the knock-on effects, as I've said, of certain tenders that in and of themselves look okay, but they actually limit down the line what other departments can bid for, can get tenders out for, because there's a codependency. So again, on procurement, watch out for board meddling. Do ensure there are adequate disclosures, and make sure that at-risk entities that have been flagged by Treasury, at-risk individuals, are monitored closely. And so the issue of oversight is important. let's have a look at oversight. Well, firstly, internal oversight is important. And the one thing that's important is that values-driven organizations are far less likely to have the kinds of corruption we've seen than the organizations that are not values-driven. And I think what we've seen is a profound degradation of the value system that we espouse to over time in the area of state capture. It's important that everybody is seen as at risk, but there's a specific, very important person in an organization called internal audit. Sometimes internal audit is a person in the organization, and sometimes that person is actually an outside, PricewaterhouseCoopers or KPMG. And what internal audit does is that function does not report to the CEO. That function reports to the board. And when you sit with board tender documents and you're about to sign off 100 million rand for this and 10 million rand for that, internal audit come and they give the board the assurance that the entire process has had integrity, that nobody the tender wasn't written for a specific individual, that there were no late bids that were included, all of those kinds of things, right? If internal audit is corrupted, the board sometimes has no idea because they go to internal audit and internal audit says it was all fine. Okay, so that is a key area on a board where you want to ensure that you have integrity. But then there's also oversight that comes from external. So everybody's audited, right? So, and you've got all the big auditing companies that audit you, but good heavens, in the age of state, and you have the Auditor General and you have the Public Protector. But in the age of state capture, who were the people who were corrupting the system? It was exactly those who we appointed to be the external oversight. And so one has to be very careful in these settings that even in the setting of external oversight, there can be problems. What about the Public Protector, right? So we were all cool with Thuli Madonsela and her bravery in taking on those that were corrupt. But what happens when you get a Public Protector who captures the entire office? And what do you deal with that? And I'll talk to my personal experience with that in a moment. And of course, the last final check is the judiciary. And it appears that the judiciary has, in South Africa, has been one of the areas that has either been untainted or relatively untainted by the state capture space. So I'm wondering if some of you are a little bit disappointed because you came with the title of How to Steal a Public Entity, and I'm worried that maybe I haven't delivered on my promise. Okay. And so I think there are a couple of pointers. The first is that I think you need to work on your swagger. Okay? That if you're not washing your hands in 37,000 Rand bottles of champagne, you're not doing well enough. Okay? Big cars, old whiskey, and getting out there and showing your wealth. But be careful, because you might work on your swagger and actually need to work on your defense fund. This is Hamilton and Ndlovu, who is in court at the moment for PPE tender fraud at the NHLS. But he bought each one of those cars in one day and put it on Facebook and elsewhere. And the authorities were alerted because of his swagger, right? So, you know, this is very important that if you're embarking on this space, have swagger, but just make sure that the authorities are not alerted, okay? But in truth, this is no joke. Our country is ravaged by this, and state capture has moved across almost all levels of governance. But what you need to consider is that beyond the amusing title, as a board member, as an executive, in the universities, remember that? Fort Hare, gangsters are there raiding it, right? Our environments are not untainted. You need to think about what is happening when people approach an entity. They are talking about how connected am I? Am I connected with political? Have I got political cover or not? How many of the key bases have I got covered? Who do I need to get rid of? And we'll talk a little bit about this now. And how ruthless am I? And the ruthless part is something that's very important. If you take on a governance role in an entity, beware, it's ruthless. People are quite happy, as we know, to kill others for the purposes of material gain. You also need to understand that there are different types of corruption. What kind of money do the corrupt want? There are those that want to maintain the system and milk it over a long period of time, but like the mafia don't want to destroy the state. They want to milk it over a long period of time, over generations. Whereas there are others that might be quite comfortable to take their 50 million rand now and move along and have destroyed it. So there are different kinds of approaches to state capture. You also need to think about how dirty your hands will be as a potential state capture person. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And I have talked already about the Forte component. When you are dealing with these individuals, don't presume that you've got the individual. It's part of a syndicate and it's systemic. And they will no, it won't be one individual who tries to capture your organization. It will almost always be a syndicate. And so where are you going to focus for maximum extraction of money and resources? Well, we've talked about if you've got board cover, internal audit is critical. If you've got the CEO in your pocket, it's a great thing. Finance and then procurement and supply chain management, key issues, right? And what happens is that the further you go up in that seniority, the bigger your money is likely. But in addition to that, you have to watch for the hidden hand of business. Because business will come to the CEO and the supply chain management internal audit and go, well, if you rig this for me, I will give you a kickback. But in fact, the big money is with the Guptas. The big money is not, there are people in government who are phenomenally wealthy in our terms, but the biggest money is actually outside of that, with those who actually do the tendering and then give the kickbacks. And so let me give you a little bit of my personal experience. The title said some reflections, which is my reflections. I don't have all the answers. I have my reflections after more than a decade on public sector boards as well as private and NGO and research organizations. So let me give you a sense of the NHLS. When I got into the NHLS board in 2012, I think it was going into one of its deepest, darkest patches. And by the time that I had left, we had removed individuals from the board. We had fired internal audit, we'd fired the CEO, we'd fired the chief financial officer, we'd fired the head of procurement, and we fired the head of supply chain management, amongst others. So every single one of those bases were covered. In addition to that, we'd taken suppliers to court and we'd laid criminal charges and they had gone to court. But when that happens, you anger people. You anger people, and what happens then is that you have to get rid of the Tim Tuckers, the Eric Buchs, the Mpho Mpilos through scandalizing or creating lies or trying to create the impression that they are the good guys, and in fact, those that are putting them under pressure are the bad guys. And so I put up two of the groups that flashed my name up, and Mpho Mpilo, Eric Buch, Barry Shub, others, as we were the corrupt ones. We were the corrupt ones, and that is very, very unpleasant. I can tell you that when you're an honest public servant and you have to phone your kids and say, hey guys, tomorrow you're going to see my name in the press, and it is a challenge, right? It is a challenge, okay? But if you're going to step onto a board, you have to be brave and you have to be ready for this. It's not negotiable. What these guys didn't realize is that Mpho, Eric, me, and others, we didn't give a damn. We were going to go forward and make sure that the NHLS was cleared of these individuals. In addition to that, as a person under pressure, you report those who are putting you under pressure to the public protector. And you can do it anonymously. So the public protector then issues a report that they have an anonymous complaint about you. And they did that with the NHLS. And over almost 6 years, we had to defend multi-million rand suits. Only in January this year for the High Court to throw out the entire report of the public protector because it was scandalously wrong. And obviously that comes as relief, but I didn't see Eyewitness News or City Press noting that. And this is, I think, part of the maturity of the boards that we need to have, is that it does come with risk, what I talked about earlier, personal risk, financial risk. We did discuss the possibility of taking personal protection. We didn't do it, but it comes with risk. And if you're going to stand up to these boards and stand up to the individuals, you need to be ready to do that. And so finally, in conclusion, how to improve this. It would be wrong of me as a clinical virologist to try and convince you that I have all the answers. I don't. But it's a personal reflection story. And it's about governance. It's about ensuring a balanced environment, a balanced executive and board and political environment. It's about having skilled executives. We have challenges with the level of skill of our executives, and that influences the functioning and it influences the opportunities for corruption. The boards need to be skilled, and if they're not skilled, change them or train them. I've talked about oversight integrity, internal oversight and external oversight. Critically important that we manage that. And I'm a firm believer in open tender processes wherever possible. But finally, my primary message today is we need more active citizenry. We need more engagement. We need personal responsibility. Isn't it a worry that we have a new president of the Medical Research Council? Isn't that great, right? The NHLS is about to announce, I presume, its new CEO. Did SACAMED go to the NHLS or the MRC and go, hey, you are organization, you're not just autonomous, you represent us. We want to be part of this to ensure that you have integrity in this process. Why is it that all of the different processes are not given far more input from stakeholders? We seem to think that the line ministry and these entities have it under control. We need to have active citizenry to ensure that those bodies that represent us, employ us, control our space, actually do work to our benefit. We need to own the space and be brave in that space. And I just reflect on the opening lines of our Constitution. We the people need to own these public entities. We the people need to ensure that they are held accountable, and we the people need to enjoy the benefits of it, because we the people need to serve those who are most poor and marginalized. Thank you very much.
How stunning was that, Tim? That was so fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to open up first for some reflections and questions from those in the room, and then those online. You can put anything in the chat, obviously, but it would be great if you could prepare as well to ask your question out loud, preferably with your video on would be lovely, because we are able to see you in the room. Thoughts? Yes, please, Tracy, then Nisha, then Itsiki, and then I'm coming. So 3 questions in the room, and then I'm coming online.
So thank you very much, Tim. And I think you said one of the things there that I think is quite important, that is very seldom, which is around capacitating boards. I mean, formally, you know, you don't become a doctor if you have not been to medical school.
Yeah.
It's the same, I suppose, with management. You know, you get somebody who's a clinician and you think they'll be able to manage, you know. And I think what you've highlighted, certainly I can share that experience that, you know, I've been on many boards, but you don't really get capacity. You learn on the job most of the time. And I think that is a high risk. So if we have, do you think that there's any, having been kind of doing this for a while, do you think that that is coming? I mean, I'm seeing, for example, in the college is now putting a process whereby examiners will no longer be able to examine before they have some kind of certificate. So more of that is coming different spaces. But on the governance side, I haven't heard anything that is moving towards that direction that basically says, if you want to be a board member, you must have done this kind of level of training before you do that. Do you think that's coming? I mean, we've had serious governance issues in our country. Do you think, is that coming, do you think?
I hope it's coming. I think there is talk of it. You know, I think that there's only so much time that we have students with us. And I think that one of the reflections that people sometimes have is we were never trained to be teachers, but now we've become teachers. We were never trained to run a GP practice or a specialist practice, and now we're running that. There's so many levels at which one degree cannot necessarily, you know, give you all of the skills. But I do think that the importance of board training cannot be underestimated. And, you know, you get these procedural questionnaires from government where government decides everybody needs to be evaluated and then trained. And then I think I've had some questionnaires about board and my personal capacity where I've had to answer 300 questions, and then you never get any feedback. So the line department can say, yes, we've evaluated their competence, but there isn't meaningful engagement around it. And so I think that part of it is that we need to mentor. Part of it is that the whole board mustn't rotate off and then a new board come on, because you need continuity. And then, once you get onto that, you need to mentor those who are on it. How often do we need mentorship in our clinical specialties, in our academic specialties? We need that in our governance specialties as well. We need this in you're part of the executive in the deanery. Have you been trained in executive functioning? There are these things, and there are mechanisms. Probably the most prominent of those is the Institute of Directors of South Africa, that has a formal training program for executives, for board members, and you can bring them in, and you can also do training online. So I think that one of the things that I would argue for is that while you want a diversity of people who might not be trained, that once you get on, you need to do the online Institute of Directors trainings on how to be a board member. The chairperson of the board should do the training on what it is to be a good chairperson. Those on audit and risk should be asked to do the audit and risk training, and so on. So, so that you get a spread. And so I think the answer is it's improving, but we've still got some way to go. Go ahead.
That was really a fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. At the risk of sounding naive, so a lot of what we do is we train undergraduate students, and you mentioned this degradation of values. It's fundamentally a lack of honesty and integrity. And I think we as teachers are seeing that too amongst our students. For example, last year I was fully aware of final year medical students who thought it was okay to demand cars and exorbitant amounts of money to give their internship placement to someone else. Calls are being sold regardless of the HR contract, and a training contract where interns are supposed to meet certain requirements to be independent practitioners, but they're selling calls at exorbitant amounts just so they can get out of it. And so this is all a norm. I'm not aware of it being a norm when I was an intern. Maybe I was naive then as well. But we're seeing this, people getting away with this. And so it becomes the norm that this is what happens, this is the way of the world. Yeah. And how do we address it at the young level? Because we are essentially training the future board members, the future leaders in government, especially by virtue of the power that they have as healthcare professionals. So any thoughts on that?
Democracy is a bottom-up thing. Values is a top-down thing. If your most senior people are corrupt, dishonest, lazy, whatever it is, that is the culture that permeates. And so when we ask for a solution, as senior people, we must, instead of looking out the window, we must look in the mirror, metaphorically. As senior people, it's up to us to behave with the highest level values, because culture is the combined values that we espouse as an organization. And so it is important that we hold our leaders accountable, not just for everything, but it starts with values. And so I think that discussion, as I say, is about an inward looking, and where democracy is a bottom-up approach. The values and the culture that we have in a department, in a faculty, in a university, in a country, in a corporate is top down, and we need to hold our leaders accountable for their values first.
Yeah, this is beautiful. I think Tracy and Nisha have spoken to what I was going to speak to. But I mean, in view of what is happening, we have knots in our stomachs, because we can see the trajectory that we're going to go the same route, and nothing is going to change. But I'm wondering if there is space for you to give this lecture. I mean, as Nisha has said, that final year students, they're going out into this world, and so if already there are these perceptions that they can do anything, they can sell, whatever. Can we not make this a requirement that they attend your lectures, so that, well, first of all, request that you avail yourself. They attend, because when you're talking about a values approach, we teach them, that this is how they should be as healthcare professionals. But beyond that, we present them to the world. So they take whatever. So if there's shortcuts, we know that there's quite a few graduates now who are unemployed. And it's because of this corruption. I mean, we can change the title of a topic, you know, how to steal a country, how to steal a university. You know, there's so many variables that one can input into that because of the levels of corruption. And I mean, I'm just reminded of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu and how he often said that we've lost that moral fiber, you know, so it means that we are not capable, there's only a few people who are able to assist in editing and self-correcting is something that is lacking mostly. So, yeah, I think I'm just one because I mean, this is really, it's touched the core of our existence. And I also think that the other thing is around the apprenticeship, because I mean, what you're speaking to is something that we are having to navigate as we speak. I'm sure so can speak to that. There are many issues, even in our space. We're not saints.
Sure. That's what you all were going to be
Yeah, so thank you though for giving me all of that run.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah.
I mean, you know, I think that we are all are public servants and we need to do, or servants of the public. I'm not a public servant. And we need to do what is important in our country. So what you proposed, I think is important. I'm very quick to say that I don't hold any disproportionate space here. I just give you some reflections from my own experience, but of course I'm willing to share that with more people. You want to see if anybody wants? Steve raising his hand. Oh, Steve, yes. Hi, Steve.
How's it? What a fantastic talk, man. Thank you. Just a reflection on my own journey that in my 20s, I was a full-time clinician. In my 30s, I started to take some management responsibility when the previous superintendent left and said, oh, you can just sign the leave forms. It's simple. And it's only later on in my 40s, maybe 50s, that I became aware of the importance of boards. And now looking back from my 60s, I'm thinking, yo, man, that was all going on in the background and I was not aware of it. So the comment is a reflection on the sequence and the degree to which, you know, we need to develop that a pipeline in a way of people who are prepared to, as you say, take the courage to not just do the training and sit on boards, which sounds very nice, but to actually call out the issues when they need to be called out. And my question, if there's a question in this, is the value system in the private health sector versus the value system in the public health sector. Because, and you know, looking at the NHI possibility and there just seems to be such a clash of values there, where the one is really looking at healthcare as a commodity that can be bought and sold, and the other is looking at healthcare as a human right. And I don't know how we get those values aligned, even with the legislation that's been proposed, because we're saying at the fundamental level, this is about values. So there's a question.
You know, Steve, I'm a congenital optimist. And one of the things that I like to believe is that irrespective of whether one's in the public or the private sector, there are a range of people, personalities, value system, but I'm a believer that the majority of people want to do good. And so I think that we need to try and find common ground in order to harness as much of the good in all sectors. I think that I share your view that there are different value systems and that money is a more overt driver of the private sector. but I don't want to misquote who it was. But you know, the classic quote of "I didn't go through the struggle to be poor." You know, and that was a smut. Right? So here's a public service person espousing the values associated with things that we would normally think of as the private sector. I also think that the best organizations are those that are values driven. I'm of the opinion that the worst organizations are not those without values. The worst organizations are those that say they have the best values but don't. And I think that our public sector has sadly, in some spaces, got into a situation where, in fact, although we believe that the public sector is driven by non-financial matters, in fact, it's been corrupted, and they espouse the values of public service, but there's too much of personal gain that is happening. And so to that end, I think that we might actually find that there's more common ground between public and private. There is a very worrying set of legislation in the future, which we all believe in the human rights approach and the importance of universal healthcare. But while some are worried about it because they might reduce their ability to earn money and have personal gain, I'm just really worried that it's the poor and marginalized that are going to have worse healthcare at the end. And so, you know, I think that we need to try and harness all of the good, try and minimize those that have poor values and what they espouse, and try and focus on the poor. I don't know, that maybe sounds a bit preachy, Steve, but I was trying to give an answer. I'm not sure if I've been successful.
Thanks, Tim.
Rodney.
Hi there. Yeah, Tim, thanks very much. I was very disappointed you didn't give us a primer on exactly how to do the stealing, although you did at the end suggest some mechanisms. So I think what's always interested me, and I suppose it remains a source of great disturbance, is that in our own profession, particularly in our roles as teachers and researchers, thinkers, we also do participate on boards and so on, but that's, for most of us in primary healthcare, that's actually not the primary route that we're going to take. There's relatively little talk through our professional routes of corruption and capture. And this is an empirical issue because one can look at the literature that's put out in epidemiology, social epidemiology, whatever you want to call it, understanding of sort of community health, the factors that operate locally, our relationship to the state and to government. It seems to me it's a subject, and I talk to all of us, myself and all my colleagues, that I think it's a subject for which there is a certain amount of distaste or avoidance. Now, that avoidance, I think, is based on a certain anxiety about confronting and talking about the mechanisms of power in South Africa. And I think some of it is the desire not to get too political. And this is used as a way of actually closing things down. Now, many people are employed in the state, so you can fully understand the desire not to cross what's called a political line. It was used in the previous regime and it's being used now. So really, what comes to mind, for example, just an example of what I'm talking about, is an article by Sharon Fon and Letitia Rispel on the cost to the health system of corruption. I don't know how many people have actually read that article, but it seems to me there are very few of that type of investigation around. And the mechanism of power does take us to a consideration of our own positionality, and also the sort of thing that we're talking about in public, writing about, teaching our students. It's a bit uncomfortable, because I think there is a feeling that one should support the government of the day having come via a liberation route. It's all breaking down. And I think, to me, to understand what's happening, you really need to understand the system in South Africa. And the best source of understanding that I have found is a Brazilian series. Now, Brazil's a similar country with huge historical inequities, a long history of violence and of competition for the state. It's called The Mechanism. And what I learned from that is we talk about a system here, a system that's coming into being because people have previously been excluded and they're looking for mechanisms to get in. And that affects every level. And impunity is really quite shocking but it shows that the powers, the wind behind this is a type of solution, dysfunctional solution to the 1994 compromise, is very much with us. So Tim, you don't have to answer directly because I've been ranting a bit, but I think it's something that we all as public health practitioners, clinicians, teachers should be talking about more. Thank you.
Thanks, Rodney. Can I just add one other thing here? I think we've had a government that's been too powerful. There was never any time up until now where national governments, some provinces have been slightly different, have thought that they were going to lose the election. Well, we may see regime change in May in terms of national, the majority national party having to go into coalition, provinces, districts having to go into coalition. And I think that as part of that last slide of we the people kind of sentiment, we need to return to that hackney statement around politicians should be scared of their voters because otherwise we vote them out. And we haven't managed to do that in the age of the first political party post-liberation to hold them accountable. We now may be holding them accountable through the ballot over time. But as we get some form of regime change, whether it's provincial, district, or national, let's return to a model where we have active citizenry and we hold them accountable in as many ways as possible. Gavin, last question. Yeah, I think we're out of time. Gavin.
Thanks a lot, Tim, for the talk. It's a practical question. So I just want to know, fraud and corruption seems to have been pretty minimal in the Western Cape. And so comparing that to national departments and other provincial departments, what do you think are the key features that is keeping fraud and corruption quite low levels in the Western Cape departments?
Thanks, Gavin. I mean, I think that corruption is everywhere. It's about how much. I think that's the first thing. The evidence does support your contention that there are areas of the country where there's less corruption, and the Western Cape does appear on the auditing trail to have less. And I would go back to the comment I've made around a values system that drives governance. Love them or hate them, the local government in the province more than a decade ago went through a value system using the Barrett's value system within which every aspect of their work was going to be quantified in terms of existing values, desired values, and how to get there. And that is not just a set of words that you put on a poster on the wall. Those then get translated into systems, personnel structures, how to operate. And so I agree with you. The evidence is there that the Western Cape, while it has some corruption, has less. And I would argue that one of the features that drives that is a positive value system. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim.
Is it also written not that because they only have the Western Cape and for them it's a do or die, you know, so they have to get it right.
Yeah, political contestation.
Yeah, so there's also the fact that for them there's no option to get it wrong. So they do that and they do that really well. I think for me the greatest test of what you're saying around values is if they had more than one province, and you could see if are they able to then diffuse that into other provinces and be able to lead like that in other provinces. I mean, I don't think we can tell with them just having the Western Cape as just one province. There's too much to lose for them to get it wrong.
I hear you, and I think you may well be right.
Yeah.
So colleagues and all colleagues are both online and in person. I think that was really a valuable input, a values-driven, valuable input that's given a lot of food for thought. I really did like the focus on values. It does seem like something tangible that we can, even in our current school, think more about and pick up on. And I'm definitely looking forward to more of your inputs in our teaching programs. And thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you for being here in person. It's always nice to have some people in person. And next week, same time, same place. But let's all give Tim a round of applause. Bye, everybody.